Want a job where you can use your talents, make a difference, and have the freedom of remote work? Then meet Belay. Belay has contractor opportunities for proven professionals, providing administrative support and social media strategy to fast-paced organizations throughout the United States, all from your home. To learn more, just visit belaysolutions.com/jobs to apply. That's BELAY solutions.com/jobs.
At Encova Insurance, we're committed to leaving a lasting impression in all communities we serve. We support local causes that mirror the values and interests of our associates, agents, and policyholders. We partner with organizations that are dedicated to improving lives. We are committed to building something greater than ourselves, encircling our communities with strength and support. We are Encova Insurance. Learn more at encova.com.
Hey everybody, I hope you appreciate this episode of the Preacher Boys podcast. If you'd like to support the mission of the show and help stories like this be told every single week, then you need to head over to patreon.com/preacherboys. That's patreon.com/preacherboys and become a patron today for any amount. Thank you so much for your support of the show and enjoy the rest of the episode.
Trigger warning. This podcast contains descriptions of various abusive situations. Listener discretion is advised. You are listening to the Preacher Boys Podcast, a podcast shedding light on decades of mental, physical, and sexual abuse within the independent fundamental Baptist movement. The testimonies shared on this podcast are told from the personal experience and perspective of the survivors. Not all legal outcomes are known or final. Any suspect is presumed innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. To find more information about the Preacher Boys podcast and upcoming documentary, visit preacherboysdoc.com or connect on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter with the handle @preacherboysdoc. Now, here is your host, Eric Skwarczynski.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Preacher Boys podcast. My name is Eric Skwarczynski. As always, I'm your host, walking through some of these interviews and trying to shed a light on abuse within the independent fundamental Baptist movement. Today's episode is a really good conversation, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But I also want to take a second and tell you guys about a pretty new story that's just happened, so you can look into it. Todd Travis Hogue, he's a graduate of Hyles-Anderson College in Crown Point, Indiana, is currently listed on their alumni page as of the recording date, which is February 11th. The case has not yet exceeded the statute of limitations. It involves two teenage girls at the time being raped or sexually assaulted by Todd Travis Hogue. So that case is active right now. If you visit preacherboysdoc.com, you can visit the abuser database, find out more information about that specific case there. It's also one of the most recent posts on the Preacher Boys Facebook page. And hopefully, with the case being within the statute of limitations, we can actually see something be done. One of the hardest things to see is so many stories in my inbox, so many stories that you can find online, so many reports, news stories about women who, weren't able to come forward until it was too late and the statute of limitations had expired. You see these guys sitting there smugly for decades with absolutely no repercussions, nothing happening to them, but all these victims having to sit there and deal with the repercussions for many decades moving on. And so hopefully with the nature of this case, with the statute of limitations being what it is, I'm hoping that awareness of this story and appropriate legal attention will see it be dealt with in the proper way. And there's so many stories that haven't even been talked about yet on the show. Just so many stories of guys who have gotten away with this stuff for so long, and it's disgusting. It's disgusting. It's infuriating. It's wrong, and it needs to stop. And I hope this episode, this podcast, kind of pushes things in the right direction as far as seeing awareness raised about these issues, about legal action being taken, appropriate legal action being taken. And so we see guys like this get put behind bars. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the episode here. This interview is with John Hollifield. John is a pastor. He is currently teaching at a church. I'll drop a link in the show notes below. But we talk quite a bit about the issues he saw within the independent fundamental Baptist movement. We talk about the experiences that he had and the odd things that pushed him away from that church and the churches he was involved with. John did ask me to disclose at the beginning of the interview. Once we got off our conversation, he asked me to just disclose this, so there was no hiding what was happening and there was no cover up on his end. But he did want me to make clear he does have a younger brother who was arrested for the sexual abuse of a minor. And although that didn't come up in the conversation with the way that I introduced the episode, he did want that to be clear. He wanted that to be out in the open and something that people understood for context. When he found out, he did make the proper steps, made sure it was reported to the authorities, made sure that the pastors there did the right thing, and I applaud him for that. And it's not an easy thing to accept or to share that a family member is doing something like this. And so I just wanted to let you guys know that. That was his wish. I'm not speaking out of turn. I just wanted to share that with you guys. There's so much on my heart, guys. I know so many of you reached out talking about, just hanging in there, sharing these stories. This is a difficult project to be working on, and that couldn't be more accurate. It's incredibly tiring, exhausting, saddening, upsetting, infuriating to see this stuff happening, to see duplicates of the same story happening over and over and over again across all 50 states. And I just say from the bottom of my heart that I hope this podcast and the stories that are told will really share and spark a passion for people to see more light shine on this, more victims given a chance to speak out, more predators stopped. And I really appreciate every single one of you listens, shares episodes, leaves comments, helps look into cases. Every single one of you is so important to what we're doing here. Thank you for listening. Not to start this off on an extremely dour note, but I just wanted to say that. That's what's immediately on my mind right now. And I'm just really hoping and praying with everything in me that this podcast, this documentary, these stories enact change that should have happened the minute the first IFB church began abusing its people, the minute the first time a guy like Jack Hyles abused his power, the first time that someone went and duplicated the evil, wicked things that they learned to do from the leadership before them. It's, the best time for this to change would have been at the very beginning, but the second best time is right now. So please, just listen to victims, address abuse, and if your family is in a church that has tendencies toward these kind of things, just leave. It's the best thing you can do for your family. Thank you all for listening, and now let's get into the interview with Jon Hollifield. All right, John, thank you so much for joining me on the Preacher Boys podcast. First, just tell me kind of how you got introduced to the IFB movement. What was kind of the start of that relationship there?
Yeah, so I was born into an IFB home. My dad went to Trinity Baptist College in Jacksonville, Florida, and that's where he met my mom. My mom graduated from there. My dad went there, and he had gone to the Sword of the Lord conference in 1980 after being converted, and he was looking for a Bible college to go to, and basically Bob Gray, which I'll mention some things about Bob Gray a little bit later, was the one that made an impact on him. So he went there, and he did not graduate. He wanted to be an evangelist, but he had been divorced. And so in the IFB world, the D word is the scarlet letter. And he left. They left there after they had had a couple kids, and he went to a church in North Carolina that was Big Bus Ministry. It was actually pastored by the son-in-law of Bobby Robertson, who pastors Gospel Light in Walkertown, North Carolina. And he was going to go be a bus captain and everything. But then the guy said, here, I want you to do this. And your wife teaches the Christian school, and I'm going to pay you nothing. And my dad was like, no, I got a family to support. So he went to the church. He worked the church. He worked the bus ministry. But he just worked a full-time job, which I applaud him for that. But he still was in it. And so that pastor left when I was a child, and we got a new pastor in. And so the church that I grew up in was independent fundamental Baptist, but they weren't serious about it, if I can say that. I'm basically, looking back on it, the only thing that I could say was real IFB about the church that I grew up in as a teenager and those things was they were KJV only, but they didn't rub that in your face. Now, my dad did. That was my dad's big thing. I remember growing up and seeing D.A. Waite's books on his bookshelf and having Peter Ruckman's books on his nightstand. That was his thing. And so I was some things that I went through and with my parents in high school. I was ready to go to college, and I wanted to do something with psychology. I wanted to go into that realm, and my dad was pretty adamant about, hey, will you go to a good college here, good college, and meaning an IFB college to get a year under your belt before you go do something like that. I was like, sure. So at the time, he was working in a construction company, and they were building dormitories for, and I don't mind mentioning names or anything like that with this. I will hold back a little bit on my time in West Virginia because I still have some friends up there, and I don't want to sever those relationships. But we went to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and I went to what was known then as Champion Baptist College. Now they've changed, and they've actually swung the complete other direction. They're Champion Christian College, and I went to Champion Baptist College in 2005, and that was my real introduction to the basic IFB world. And I got into it, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I jumped into it, and it wasn't a month there. They had a conference, and I surrendered to the ministry and being a youth pastor. And so I was all about it. I ate everything up, everything. The preaching, the preachers they'd have come in there, I ate it all up. And worked a bus ministry, and so did a lot of those things. And then towards there were some things that I just didn't get. Like they started with the rules, like the girls' dress standards, and I was complaining about that. And my dad was like, "Are you a girl?" And I was like, "No." And he's like, "So why is it bothering you?" And I was like, well, okay. I'll just leave it alone. I thought some of the rules were dumb, but they didn't really apply to me at the time, so I just let it go.
Right.
I never really jumped onto that as a standard. It just never made sense to me.
Right.
That modesty dress standard for women, the knee-length skirts and all that stuff. I went to work at a summer camp in Arkansas as part of a scholarship program for the college. And that was where I really started getting exposed to some, seeing churches come in to the ultra right, the culottes
Right.
down to the floor, and guys could only wear blue jeans doing any activity. And that just sort of started, I just got frustrated. I was like, explain to me why. But at the same time, I was getting definitely a very shallow education,
Right.
I mean, it was more concerned with teaching you to do bus ministry, go soul winning, do this, than actually teaching you theology, doctrine, thinking through things, critical thinking, applying theology to everyday situations.
So was this the first time you had these frustrations or noticed these oddities within the IFB? Was college the first time that you kind of started questioning that stuff?
Yeah.
Up until then was completely, like you said, it was just bought in, like I take it for what it is and don't question.
Well, yeah, I mean, the only thing that I ever saw beforehand was the KJV only thing, and I was all into that. Whenever I
So I don't want to cut you off, but there's probably some people listening who aren't familiar with when you say KJV only. So can you, I know it's a topic you could spend a lot of time talking about, but can you tell me what that means and why that is such an important issue within independent Baptist churches?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing is too, and I don't want to try to lump everybody into the same, because
Right.
even the KJV only crowd's fragmented.
Yeah.
Because there's about 4 or 5 different groups that.
Well, you mentioned Ruckman, and Ruckman's teaching is not widely accepted within.
Ruckman's the extreme of the extreme, and so basically the idea is this: that the King James version that we have is the only Bible that English people, some take it beyond that anybody should be using,
right.
And that other translations can range from either being bad, unacceptable, to the work of Satan, the work of the devil.
Right.
And then they go from extremes to, somebody could get saved using a King James Bible, but if you want the pure word of God, you got to get King James too. No one can get saved unless they are saved using a King James version. And so I went to a Christian school in high school where they had the dress standards for that, but I personally never knew anybody that lived that outside of a school or anything. So when I come to college, this is all like, and then the politics of everything, this. And so by the end of Bible college, I was jaded. I was very jaded because I looked up the guy, the pastor and the president of the college was Eric Capacey, and I loved him. And he was a very loving guy. And I just saw him get treated terribly by for stupid things. It was like, okay, the college basketball team wore shorts to play basketball instead of wind pants. Therefore, R.B. Olette is telling people around the country, Champions Liberal, don't send your kids there. And then he looks in with David Gibbs to look at getting the college accredited. And then you got other pastors around the country saying they're going liberal, they're going Southern Baptist. Like that was the unpardonable sin. And I guess it was more of a, hey, this is the guy that I love, and you guys, this doesn't make any sense. And so it was sort of a defensive thing. And I got jaded. I graduate Bible college. I finished in 3.5 years. So I start interviewing for youth pastors. I interviewed several times. And this is my perspective. I know that I can't prove any of this is not the truth.
Right.
But I was nobody's son. I was not from a big church. I was not from a popular youth group or youth pastor. I was a nobody there. And I didn't get hired by anybody. And so a Southern Baptist church that my brother was affiliated with in my hometown in North Carolina called me up and said they were looking for a youth pastor. And I said, yeah, okay. And so I left the Independent Fundamental Baptist very jaded, very, I'm done at that time. But see, the thing was, I didn't know anything. I just knew standards and rules and why I didn't like the standards and rules. I didn't know any theology. And for that reason, I went there. And of course, there, it was sort of like an opposite. And I enjoyed it for the first little bit. I was like, this is great. Nobody's judging anybody because a teenage girl came to the youth activity in shorts above her knees. And it's okay. And so my wife and I poured our lives into those teenagers for a year. And then by the end of the year, I realized that me and the pastor I was not as unindependent fundamental Baptist as I had thought I was. And so there were things that we were going 2 different directions. And so I called up Brother Capacey and I was like, I think I need it. So he links me up with an independent fundamental Baptist guy in West Virginia. So now I leave there after a year. We go to West Virginia, and this is where the experience comes from. So yeah, I know that you had talked about an earlier podcast where you were talking about sort of getting ideas and viewpoints from many different because they're so afraid. My dad used it this way. He said every guy gets their orders from headquarters, and so the different sects, Hiles, Anderson, West Coast, North Valley. Let's see, you got the one in Florida, you got the Longview group in Texas, and then you got Crown and Clarence Sexton. So the church that I went to in West Virginia was the pastor, basically most of the people that came from there, they were Crown. Anything they did, they graduated from Crown. They were close with the Sextons. Anything that we did, conferences, groups, things, it was all going back to Temple and Knoxville and Crown. So I got very familiar with Crown right off the bat. And I was, even from the get-go, I was not a fan of Clarence Sexton. The first conference we went to, I just thought, this is a guy that is full of himself. And
what gave you that? Was it just a gut feeling? Was it something that the way that he said things about himself, or was there something specific that just really hit you? Oh, that's weird.
It was a controlling factor of everything that he did in the service. So you go to a conference and he wants to sit there and tell you, we went to a marriage conference. I loved the marriage conferences, except for when he was up there.
Right.
Because it was like, hey, I want everybody to do this. Now stop. Now turn to your wife and say this. I want you to talk to your wife for about 90 seconds. Now stop. And it's like, this is just a power trip. This is all this is. He's sitting there controlling everybody, and hundreds of people or 1,000 people in the audience just because he can. It served no purpose to help our relationship, because it wasn't even enough time to get the conversation going with your spouse. It was, and I saw it with invitations. He would have these altar calls and have people come down there, and then if somebody tried to get up to leave, no, stay down here. We're going to have a prayer. He did not like people leaving the altar call until he said the prayers that they could leave the altar call. And I was like, I never got with it. But, I was trained at college to be a yes man. You get in there, you serve the pastor, you make the pastor look good, you do all this. And so we went there, and I was just, I was young. I just wanted to serve God. I was so excited. So we have our initial meeting. The pastor hires us. We move our stuff there. Day one, I come in, and he has initial meeting with me and my wife, and wants to go over sort of some expectation stuff. And everything was, okay, cool. And then he says this. He says, have you guys thought about having children? We're like, yeah, but it's, we wanted to wait a little bit. That's all we said. We wanted to wait a little bit. He said, okay. He said, I would like for you to make a verbal agreement with me that you're not going to have kids for 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So I'm like, okay. I wanted to serve. I was ready to get in there. We were thinking about waiting at least a year anyway, so I didn't think anything about it. Later on, 3 years later, when I'm on my way out, I'm talking to my best friend. I tell him that story, and he's like, I would have walked out of the room right there and said, see ya. I said, really? Was that crazy of a request? I didn't even get it then. Now I think how idiotic.
Right.
And so we basically, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, just going at it. And then they had a Christian school there. They were wanting to take the Christian school. They had Christian school traditional up until about 6th grade. And then the Christian school, the high schoolers in junior high did DVD courses. And so they wanted to take the Christian school full traditional. So they brought me in, and they said, would you be willing to teach a class to help us do traditional? I said, yeah, absolutely. I said, I love history, so maybe a history class and a Bible class. I said, okay. I get my schedule. Now, I'm the youth pastor. I'm the full-time youth pastor with a youth group for about 20 to 30, give or take some. And, basically also doing whatever they need me to do. And then I get my schedule. I'm doing 5 periods, then the teacher quits, and now I'm doing 7 periods a day.
Wow.
And And then I'm teaching, one of the classes I'm monitoring a DVD course, but then the next year I'm doing 7 periods a day. And they're putting me in science classes and math classes. And I'm like, listen, guys, I don't know any of this stuff. Do these parents realize what kind of education their kids are getting?
Yeah.
But the stickler to the whole thing that I just dealt with and put up with, and it was one of the things that caused me to say, all right, I can't do this anymore, was I never got a penny from the Christian school.
So it was completely volunteer, so to speak.
Absolutely. It took up 50 hours of my work week, but I didn't get paid. And the reason why I'd say, well, you might make the justification, well, the church was paying you, so that's part of your church pay. Well, the only thing that bothered me about that was the principal of the Christian school was the song director and got a paycheck from the church and a paycheck from the school.
Right.
And so that I took that a little bit as long as I could. So the other big thing that happened there that sort of hurt us and was 2 years go by. My wife comes to me and she's like, you know what? I'm ready. I'm ready to have a kid. I'm ready to have a baby. I was like, oh, well, we got to wait another year. And she's like, seriously? And so I called a pastor friend of mine and I was like, hey, I got a question for you. So I was asking his counsel on it, and I told him what I just told you about the agreement that I made. And he cracked up. He said, brother, there ain't no man in this world needs to be telling you what to be doing in your bedroom. I was like, oh, okay. So she gets pregnant, and I could tell that they were aggravated. And we had the decision to make on whether to put our baby in daycare and her stay teaching at the Christian school or her stay home. And they thought we should put the baby in daycare and her teaching the Christian school. And we decided that it was our responsibility to take care of our children. So we decided that she was going to stay home, and they didn't like that decision either. And so that made some tension there. But the one thing that I'm ashamed of the most was, see, my wife, when she was 12 years old, her brother was killed. They had a big family. And when she was 14 years old, another brother of hers was killed. So she had already gone through the loss of 2 brothers. They were really close. The family was always close. While we're there, she's about 5 months pregnant. She gets a phone call one night, and her stepbrother, her half-brother, finds out that they were in an accident and he was killed. And, she'd been through so much, and I just knew, all right, that's it. So I made a couple phone calls. I said, hey, we got to go. So we went back to Tennessee, and we were there for the funeral. But the situation was, it was a family riding their bicycles. And a car, the son was hitting the windshield, the car hit them. So it hit the dad, which was my wife's half-brother. He died instantly, and then the car hit his wife. Now she got banged up really bad. Because of that, they had to postpone the funeral a few days for her to get out of the hospital. So whereas you normally have like a three-day turnaround, sometimes 4-day turnaround for the death to the funeral, this was actually extended a little bit longer. Well, I informed them as soon as we sort of found out that was going to be the case. I informed them, hey, this is what happened. They have to wait for the wife to get out of the hospital. So the funeral is going to be on this day, which was about 5 or 6 days later. So we were gone from the ministry that long. And so the funeral was going to be held that day. And then I said the next day we'll be traveling back. And then the day after that, we'll be back into work.
About 8 or 9 days, basically.
Right. And he texts me. He doesn't call me. No phone call.
Right.
I get a text message from the pastor, not asking how Mary's doing, not asking how my wife's doing.
Right.
Or the family, but saying, hey, we're going to need you to get back on Tuesday, which was the day of the funeral. So basically what he was saying was, as soon as the funeral's over, hit the road.
Right.
And get back. Now, this is where I told you I still to this day regret and feel shame, because I should have just texted him back and said, eh. Instead, I told my wife. And that's what I mean, I should have been the husband she needed me to be. And I said, hey, I just got a text message from Pastor and they want us back that day. She just looked at me and she came apart.
Yeah.
She was like, John, there's no way. I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm not going to be able to go back into the classroom the next day.
Right.
I said, don't worry about it. At that moment, I was so convicted. I said, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I texted him. I said, if you think this is insubordinate or not, I apologize, but here's the deal. My wife's not going to be able to do this. So we will have the funeral. The next day we'll travel. The day after that, we'll be back in the office. I apologize if you think this is being insubordinate. This is just, I got to put my wife first here. Sent the message. Never heard a reply.
Wow.
Got back. Nobody ever said anything about it at all. Like they never brought it up. They never were like, yeah, we understand. Or, it was just like, wow. But I started my exodus from there began by starting to read. Like I said, I was very shallow. Somebody kept recommending me this book called Radical by David Platt. So I was like, all right. So I read a book that's really rocked my world. And then something clicked in my brain. I want to read. I want to get some more of this. My mind was opening up past the independent fundamental Baptist stuff. And so I read Radical and I was just like, this is not like our church at all. And a couple of things happened. And so we left there. And I was still, like I said, I was still KJV only and all that stuff. I came here. And my pastor, we found a church here, and it's interesting because what's happened essentially is we have a ministry now here at our church, small church, but we have a ministry where we help people that were hurt from legalism, and that I'd say 90% of our church body are people that came from an IFB church or some type of legalism. And they found us because my pastor, we met and we were hurt. Our intention was to take 6 months off of the ministry and then go back out there and find another one. And we were visiting some churches in the area, found this guy, and he wanted to take us to dinner. Found out he had worked, I don't know if you're familiar with Franklin Road Baptist Church in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where the Sword of the Lord was involved with so long.
Yeah, it sounds familiar. And it's probably from Sword of the Lord that I'm familiar with the name. Yeah,
they are like a Mecca church almost in this area and it's part of it's because of the sword. Billy Kelly pastored there, then Tom Wallace, and now Mike Norris is the pastor there.
Oh yeah, Mike Norris. Yeah, I'm familiar with him through. I did some work with Awake America, probably 3 or 4 years ago. I'm fairly familiar with a couple of guys out of there.
My pastor worked there at Franklin Road for like 20 plus years, and he left there and he sort of had an experience where he went to a church and that guy, the pastor there, helped him sort of branch out of IFB. And so telling his stories of how pastors treated him really helped Mary and I. And he then, God used him to help us heal. And then he started, hey, why don't you listen to this guy? Why don't you read this book? And then next thing you know, he's given me opportunities to preach and do a series here and there. And, that's causing me to dive in the Bible even more and dive into the scriptures. And so, I find the ministry of John MacArthur, and the rest is history for me. I was still very KJV only. I was actually one of those people. I would teach on it and I would debate and I would look for somebody, because I always thought that people that weren't KJV only, they just didn't know. They hadn't done their work.
They just weren't educated as you were.
Right. And then I start listening to like Chuck Swindoll and Tony Evans and John MacArthur. And I'm like, these guys are brilliant with the Bible. Why are they so off with what Bible to use?
Right.
And I was at a church member's house who used to be a prison chaplain, and he had a book on his bookshelf that said The King James Only Controversy. I was like, ooh. what is this? And then I open up and read it, and it's actually a book from the opposite perspective. And I was like, there's somebody who's wrote a book on the opposite perspective? And then I opened it, and like I said, like the rest is history on that. So I decided to take our church through this. So I studied not just that book. I found other resources. I actually I went to the other side too. I've got Ruckman. I got Sam Gipp. I got William Grady and those guys, and I got their materials. I wanted to hear what they say, because I took the argument and I said, well, this is what he says. I wonder how they respond to the argument.
Right.
And so I did 9 weeks. I took our church through 9 weeks of the translation issue and leading them out of King James, because they were too. I mean, a lot of these people, and let me say this, we still use, my pastor, myself, our church members, we still use the King James Version. We do. And my reason for that was, hey, we had people that's the Bible they've used for 40 plus years.
Right.
I didn't want to tell them to go buy a new Bible when that's what they're familiar with. So we just decided to keep preaching out of it and explain. Maybe when we come to a passage that, is better explained another way. But I'll tell you this, it is hurt. I say hurt. My relationship with my father has been very fractured because of it.
Wow.
And, the first time my brother thought this was going to be a joke, he was playing around with me, and he said, hey, John doesn't believe the King James anymore. And he said, are you serious? I said, well, let me put it to you. And this is when I was very in the early stages of studying the subject. We haven't talked about it since I really have gotten it down. But I said, let me say it this way. I said, I can only be dogmatic about what Scripture says. I said, and I do not have a verse in the Bible that says the King James Version is the only version that I should use. Therefore, I cannot hold to that position. And since then, it's been a different relationship with my dad.
No, there's a lot of things that we could circle back to, but I'm kind of curious, because I've had a wide variety of guests on the show. I've had people who are now atheist or agnostic, or have, people who have left the church entirely. And, on a level of empathy, I understand people who, if their experience with church was a situation of extreme abuse, I can understand why they would not want to, darken the doorway of a church anytime soon. So when it comes to questions of, the church, a lot of times it's leaving the church plus leaving the theology. And obviously you have not done so. So I guess my question for you would be, if, obviously I don't think you'd argue the theology of Christianity is harmful, but I guess my question to you, as someone who is a pastor of an IFB church, or not an IFB church, a pastor of a church, I suppose my question would be, why do you think there are so many bad churches that are essentially pulling from Scripture, that are using Scripture as a weapon, as a battering ram, if the theology is okay? What's kept you through this?
Are you saying that whether like an IFB church has okay theology?
I guess what I would say is,
or just any church.
I guess I would say is why, you've obviously had some negative experiences with the church, with pastors using Scripture to kind of domineer and to use as a battering ram. So what is it that kept you holding on to the theology while leaving those kinds of churches?
Well, let me say this. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, because after I heard the first interview with my heart breaks with Paul, like you said, and it leaves people that the damage that it does. And that's why I wanted to talk about it, because, man, and I know some people, friends that I grew up with, that were affected by legalism. And then they didn't necessarily, I guess you can make the argument they left church because they became like, oh, we'll go every now and again, but then go to a completely left direction when it comes to church. And I guess my goal is this is, hey, instead of doing that, how about don't leave the legalism, but dive into the God's word. Find out what God's word actually says. Now, I think that a lot of there's some sinister reasons and there's some not sinister reasons. Sinister reasons why churches do that is because you do have, as I preached Sunday night from John 10 on the Good Shepherd, you do have false shepherds.
Right.
You do have guys in the IFB that are totally fake. A lot of times it's the prosperity gospel that gets these guys that are just con men. I think there are IFB preachers that are straight con men. They don't believe a word they're saying,
Right.
but they have their niche of power and control. I do think there's some sinister motives. I think some of them are not so sinister. It's comfortability, and that's what they've grown up in, and it's so shallow. I think back to some people that I just absolutely love that are still there, and I think, they've just accepted that's their world.
Well, it's almost frustrating too, because you know people that are in every area of their life amazing people, sane people, like thoughtful people, but when it comes to like addressing or confronting what they believe in a critical way, they turn off that part of their brain that would say, hey, it's not normal to have someone treat your wife like that. It's not normal for someone to demand this of your time, to pull you from your kids, to do this, to tell you how to carry yourself, what to wear, what to read, that kind of thing. But when it comes to this particular movement, they're taught, like, if you go against that, you're going against God's will for your life and your family's life. And that's kind of like, I think I've said it on previous episodes, but it's kind of this ultimate trump card of like, well, hey, this is your spiritual life we're talking about. You're not just questioning me, you're questioning what God is teaching us to do.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty bad situation to be in. But I think you address something that's really hard to cope with, especially when you first leave and there is that bitterness, which is just a natural human reaction to being in an abusive situation.
You feel like you've been lied to.
Right. And so when you step back, you want to say everybody is motivated wrongly and they're trying to just do damage and gain power. And the truth is, and I think you hit on this, is you do have the con men, the abusive cult leader types, the Jack Hyles of the world. And, and I think there's more of those than I think some would admit within IFB circles. But there are also people who are well-intentioned, who believe that this is what they're supposed to do, who are trained by these guys. And so they pick up all these harmful patterns of behavior without the negative motivation behind it. And it's so hard to, especially doing the show, it's so hard knowing that some of those guys are listening. And so it's like, I want you to know that I get it. I get why you're being motivated by this, but you need to take a look behind the curtain and say, what are the guys teaching you believing? What are the guys teaching you? What's motivating that? And I think if more people were willing to look behind the curtain, which it's scary to do, I think there'd be a lot more people that would be like, hey, something's not right here.
Yeah. Well, a lot of these places, critical thinking is not taught or endorsed. In fact, I'm thinking back to the college, at the way it was at the time that I went to, I can only think of one professor that really promoted critical thinking, that promoted to try to get us to think through things.
Right.
Only one. And so, and I think if you study, I've been doing some study into cults and stuff, and looking at other cults. And one of the things that people they get comfortable. There's a comfort, and it sounds insane, but there's a comfort in knowing your world and having those expectations. Some people are being abused and they don't realize it.
Right.
And I think that you hear survivor stories, and they come out and they think back. Oh, I mean, some obviously know. That Miss Sadler that you interviewed, I mean, she knew exactly what she was going through, but she also talked about several other girls that were experiencing that stuff. That you think about how many abuse victims does it go through before one speaks out?
Right. Exactly. Well, and even the
And
ones that do, it's typically 20, 30 years later when they finally
yeah,
are in a place where they can.
yeah.
So do you define, you just mentioned, I mean, you brought it into the conversation regarding cults. Would you define like the independent fundamental Baptist movement as being a cult? Would you say that there's churches, where do you break down in that conversation as far as, because I honestly like, I think that maybe I would define maybe the movement with outliers that are not, but uh, how would you describe the movement as a whole? Would you
Well,
define it as a cult or no?
I think whenever you interviewed Stephanie, you guys brought a fantastic point out about the movement, and that's that it's fragmented. It's hard to
Right.
make labels with it because it is so fragmented. Now, my pastor did a series on cults and one time a couple of years ago, and he spent 3 messages defining a cult. And it was so funny because the whole time he's defining this thing, I'm sitting there thinking, that's an IFB church. That's an
Right.
independent fundamental Baptist church. And then me and him talked about it afterwards, and he's like, yeah, I think that there are, let me say this, and I don't want to get my best friend is still, my 2 best friends are still, considered in sort of an IFB church, and I wouldn't consider them anything like these what
Right.
we're talking about. There are some good churches in there. I do think so. I think there's the good men that are in there. I think that any church, whenever it elevates a man, or i.e. a pastor,
Right.
to the level of God, becomes a cult just like that. And that could be a Southern Baptist, a Presbyterian, a Methodist. I told somebody was bringing this up to me the other day. They said, well, the Southern Baptists have their issues, and that report about the Southern Baptist abuse victims and the Catholic. And I said, yeah, you're right. I said, but I spent 25 years as an IFB, and I will speak to what I know. I said, I could go and do research about Southern Baptists, but I have a little bit more credibility talking about the independent fundamental Baptists because I was one for 25 years.
Right. And you understand the thought processes that have produced a lot of the things that we see.
I think that there can be individual churches that are very cultic. I think that there can be major, for lack of a better term, headquarters that are cultic. When I was still in it, when I was in Bible college, I thought Hyles Anderson and First Baptist in Hammond was a cult.
Right.
I mean, you built a statue to a guy. What the heck is that about?
Right.
You build a statue of Dr. Hyles and put it out there like he's Rocky Balboa or Michael Jordan. That's idol. That's an idol.
Right. It's just a side note, but when we were driving, I was driving to a fundraising event, and we were driving past through Hammond, Indiana. I was like, I gotta see. I was already out of the IFB. I was like, I gotta see First Baptist of Hammond. I gotta see the college. So we stopped up, and I took it like 11:30 at night. I took like a selfie with the Jack Hyles statue. Just threw up a peace sign, and that was like hilarious to me. But it was one of those weird things where I was like, man, this is just so weird. It was just a weird experience of like seeing it in person, being like, man, they really think he's like. I mean, it was like Walt Disney in front of Disneyland. It was just like, this is my empire. But I think the cult conversation is so interesting because like I'm always hesitant. Sometimes I'm very hesitant to say, so like when I'm writing out my post, when I'm writing out an episode, sometimes I'll write independent Federal Baptist cult because I'm referring specifically to what I see as the majority of people that follow any of those camps, because the majority of IFB churches are not truly independent. And so I know
that's the biggest joke of the IFB is, and I thought that whenever I was in college, I was like, they're not independent.
Yeah.
It's whatever Bible college they come from.
Yeah, exactly. So like, I'm not so hesitant to say that those that do adhere to the camp kind of thinking when it comes to these colleges and these churches, I'm much more eager to call them cultish or cults, because I do think that there's a cult mentality following. We follow Jack Trieber, we follow Paul Chappell, we follow Jack Hyles, we follow whoever you want to fill in the blank with.
Yeah.
And, for me, it's been the exception has been when I see a church that's not, where it's truly like, hey, we're going to do what we're going to do and not worry about affiliation.
See, I would
That's an
agree with that.
outlier.
I would agree with that. That would be a point of argument that I have with some of my friends, where they would say, it's not like that everywhere. This is just the fringe. And I'm like, I just see more of what you call the fringe as being the
Right.
mainstream, and more of the what. I do want to say this. I have found one pastor, and I don't know much about his theology, but he decides to stay in the IFB, and I will, going towards the idea of the abuse side. I do want to mention him, because I think he's done a good work of trying to sound the alarm with that stuff. And speaking of his name, I don't know if you've heard of Stacy Shiflett.
Stacy Shiflett. Yeah, I've actually been reaching out to him to try to get him on the show.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to, it's easy for us to say, because they make it easy, these ridiculousness in the IFB, but if there's a guy that stands up, I'd like to applaud that guy. And, I may disagree with him a lot on some other theological practices he has, but I want to applaud him for doing that, because, and here's the thing, you just don't see it.
Yeah.
You
and that's
don't
the thing
see
is
it.
that what's crazy is when his video came out, and I speak about this I made a guest appearance on the True Presbyterian podcast, and when we started talking down this road, and one of the things I said that was disappointing to me, and it's one of the things that started fueling what I'm doing now, is when Stacy Shiflett released the video, I believe it was a year ago now, and basically called out that, hey, there is a problem within independent Baptist churches of covering up child abuse. I thought to myself, I kind of strapped in. I was like, this is it. This is the little crack in the dam that's going to release a flood of the good guys. This is going to empower people who have been on the edge of their seat waiting to say something. And that flood never really happened. I mean, there was, it was, instead what I saw was attacks being volleyed at him on Twitter. I saw pastors speaking out directly and indirectly against him. Guys like Bob Gray Sr. Launching crazy attacks. And what I saw was instead fundraising for the criminal costs of the abuser. I saw shaming the victim. I saw shaming him. And to me, that was kind of where I was like, okay, the outlier is amazing. The movement, for what it is right now, needs to figure out what it means to be independent and to be a Christian church. And
well, let me say this. I probably should have said this in the beginning. Our church, it's interesting. Our church is Baptist Church. It's Calvary Baptist Church, Manchester, Tennessee. Baptist Church. We are, for lack of a better term, we are independent. We are not associated with anything. And we believe in the fundamentals of the faith, but the fundamentals of the faith outlined in Scripture and Scripture alone.
Right.
We would probably line up more with a Reformed Baptist than we would a independent. But if somebody says, "Are you independent fundamental Baptist?" I would say, "No, not a chance, because." Like we said earlier, it's not there's an association that is so strong, it's not independent anymore.
Right. No, that's that's just an interesting space to be, is like that. It's almost funny because it's almost this weird, like, you're kind of looked at as being like the black sheep of like, hey, we're not associated, but it's like, isn't that the point? Is that we're not part of some convention or some part of a denominational group. But when you step out like that, there is such a weird stigma around churches and pastors that are truly independent. One of my good friends, and was my pastor for a while, and performed my wedding. So like officiated. Perform's not a good word. But is Josh Ermler in Fresno. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him at all. but FresnoChurch.com. There's a plug that I don't know if he'll want from my show, but I mean, on, again, same thing. Like, if you were to like be like on paper, are you an independent church? Yes, truly independent, does not operate under the authority of another church or ministry or look to another church for approval. Are they Baptist? Yeah, they believe in believers baptism. They believe in, the authority of God's word. They believe in all of these things that are Baptist beliefs. But past that, there's literally nothing I can look at sitting down in that church where I would say, oh, this reminds me of what I grew up in. This reminds me of like the manipulation and the tactics and the mind control of
Right.
IFB churches.
And I have a friend that's doing the same thing. He has a church in Pensacola, Florida, and he is. You go to his church, you would think this is not an IFB church at all,
Right.
And he's doing a great work.
Right. Yeah, it's. Are you familiar with Stephen Hassan at all?
No.
Man, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right because I always say it just a little bit off. But he's his I think his Twitter is Cult Expert. Let me take a look really quick. But he does a lot of really helpful work with exposing, like he's worked with like Scientology, with a lot of groups that don't have, it's at Cult Expert is his Twitter handle, and I'm actually working to get him on the show as well, but that's a big fish to go after right now. But he released he has something called the BITE model, and so it's basically stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. And he talks about the difference between a healthy influence continuum and a healthy influence and a unhealthy destructive influence. And you were saying when the pastor was going through like all the different things listing out, you were like, that sounds really familiar. So this is what he has on the healthy column. He has, for individuals, they'll experience authentic self, unconditional love, compassion, conscience, creativity and humor, free will, and critical thinking. The leaders will be psychologically healthy, know their own limits, empower individuals. They'll be trustworthy and accountable. The organizations will have egalitarianism, checks and balances, informed consent, individuality and diversity, means create end. It encourages growth, and you're free to leave. So I was reading that, I was like, okay. And then here's the unhealthy side. And this is where I was like, my alarm went off and I was like, oh. So individuals will experience a false cult identity, conditional love, hate, doctrine, solemnity, fear and guilt, dependency and obedience. The leaders will be narcissistic, psychopathic, elitist, grandiose, power hungry, secretive and deceptive, and claim absolute authority. The organizations will have elitism, authoritarian structure, deceptive and manipulative. They'll clone people, which clone people stood out to me. The ends justify the means. They preserve their own power, and there's no legitimate reasons that someone is able to leave. And when I read through that, I was like, man, it's like he just went to like First Baptist Church of Hammond and said, what did Jack Hyles do?
Yeah.
But reading through that, I was like, man, there's so much. Like, you could just take that and pick it apart and be like, this applies to so many things. Like, and that's, I think that goes back to, and I know this is like a different episode because we're rabbit trailing a lot more into the actual structure of it. But I think independence is such a for an organization that's named after that ideology of independence, there's so little of it. And I think what we've seen a lot throughout this interview is it essentially goes back to when people have ultimate allegiance to one person, that one person starts a Bible college and they think, wow, if I send my kids to that college, or if I go to that college, I can become the next them. Instead of from a Christian perspective,
that pressure was there. That pressure was so there. I mean,
you can be the next Clarence Sexton. You can be the next, whoever.
I mean, we in chapel one time. we had the president, the one of the guys, the big heads of the college, it was supposed to be preaching, and instead he talked a little bit, and then he had all the guys that were supposed to be preachers, your preacher boys, and he had them all come up one by one and stand behind the pulpit of that big auditorium there that we had. He said, "I just want you to think about this being you one day." I mean, and there was this pressure, and it took me. Listen, I still struggle with it.
Right.
I still
it doesn't just leave when you leave.
Yeah, Sunday after Sunday, judging my Sunday service and how we did on how many people were in our auditorium.
Right.
And then fighting depression the next day that I was a failure. I know that's not what God's judging me by.
But you are programmed to think that.
I have to tell myself, but it's still, I'm like, man, this person wasn't here. We invited this bit. And I still do it because you had to have a large church. My dad said he remembers going to a sword conference and Hyles standing up telling every fast room, if you do not have the largest church in your area, I wouldn't let people know that I'm a preacher.
Wow.
Yeah. So you sparked something in me. My pastor and I have preached on legalism here. And I know that there's a lot of work to be done with abuse. I'm doing currently right now. I'm getting my certification in biblical counseling, and because I'm still in the training stage and still haven't counseled that many. I don't want to, what I'm saying. I don't want to speak to the area that I don't know.
Right.
You know what I'm saying. I don't want to mess up there. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there, and I think that you're helping with that. I do applaud you. It breaks my heart for people like Paul and the others that go through that and then don't come back, they end up away from God. But there is work that needs to be done there. But I think the spark that's been lit in me is in the area of waking up from legalism. Yeah. And so I've decided to write a book. I'm going to write a book on the independent fundamental Baptist movement and legalism. I'm going to talk a little bit. I've already got it. I'm gathering my research materials right now and book lists because I'm going to do a little bit on the history of the movement and the history of Baptist successionism, which is another rabbit trail to go down of how they teach Baptist history, which is terrible. I'm going to talk about shallow preaching legalism and really talk about theologically the pastoral authority dictatorship type of mentality that is very prevalent in that movement.
Well, awesome. Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, let me know when you start working on that, because I do think, it is funny, but the preacher boys thing is, it's one of the reasons. I mean, it's named that for many reasons, but one of that is that idea of copying. It's what is making this happen over and over and over again. And I think it is yes, legalism, but the legalism is how can you appease that man that's in charge, that's behind the pulpit? Some churches even say, like, he's a leader and his wife's the first lady. Like, I've seen that kind of terminology used, like, just casually.
I did that. When I was in West Virginia, that's what I know. I was telling people, no, you got to understand the pastor's wife's the first lady. We need to treat her
right.
And I was one of those people that did that.
So I think that kind of research into it, like what you're doing, is good, because I think it's going to show that the reason that all of this is cyclical and it keeps happening in a systematic way is because people are replicating themselves exactly. And when you have a corrupted belief system and you duplicate it hundreds and thousands of times through colleges and through conferences and through books and devotionals and all these different means, you're going to start seeing more and more of these cases that look exactly the same. And that's how you get someone who is in Hammond, Indiana, experiencing the same thing as someone who's in Santa Clara, California, or someone who's in, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, or Greenville, South Carolina, because they're all coming from the same corrupted source. And so you have a network of destruction literally spread out across the U.S. And whether people are well-intentioned or not, the materials they're being given and the tools they're being given to work are damaged from the get-go. And so you're not going to see any kind of success with those tools. I guess this kind of gets us, I know we've talked for a little while, and this kind of gets us to where the question I kind of ask everybody, and you may have answered a little bit, but I'm curious to ask again. Do you think that there is hope for the IFB movement as we know it today, or is it something you feel people need to step away from and, kind of do what you guys are doing, where it's like, hey, we may have one or two similarities, but we wouldn't really even identify as that camp? Or do you think these ministries inspired by a First Baptist of Hammond and all these different places, do you think they're just flawed from the get-go? And, where do you fall on that range? Is there hope for it? Is there not,
Yeah, I think some people
I like to end on the easy question.
That is. Yeah. And I thought that I've thought about this, because when you think about, you normally ask it, is there reform for the IFB? I've heard you ask it that way.
Right.
When you think about reform or reformation, the first thing you have to understand is that God is the one who brings the Reformation. The Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, where we first were introduced with that kind of idea, Luther was not intending to reform the Catholic Church when he nailed his 95 Theses. He was just wanting to discuss some issues. So first of all, that would have to be something that God in his sovereign will decided that needed to be done. The other thing is it is a fragmented organization, so it would be difficult for something to happen. I'd say if there's one person, and you made an very astute point on this about Stacy Shiflett, if there was one situation that could have happened with that, it would have been Stacy standing up. But I think that there's many doctrinal issues too that come into play with the IFB. The other thing, and this is part of me doing some research that I've got, is what's going on with the IFB right now. Because you actually have a split going on with two sections of the new IFB. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
Yeah.
But you have this guy, and very cultic, Stephen Anderson.
Even
in
the people
Arizona.
within IFB circles would say he's cultish.
Absolutely. He is trying to go start a new IFB, which is probably more toxic than what we've been discussing.
Yeah.
And then at the same, and all this is happening in the Southwest, you have another group that's doing it's interesting because both monikers are going towards them, another new IFB, which is more of along the lines of a more modernist and adapting some pragmatism into it, of being up to date. I think one guy that's really been sort of championed is leading this is a guy named Josh Tice out in Las Vegas. And I haven't seen a whole lot that I would have issues with him. He's doing a good job. But my question with that is is it going to avail to much? And then the rest of the country is what's considered the old IFB. And now I'm going to get into my personal opinion. My personal opinion is I think that the old IFB is going to die. I just think it's going to die. I think that the new IFB, the Anderson is doing, the cultic one is going to dissolve itself. It's going to eat itself up because they can't even get along with each other. One guy does something that just doesn't agree. Sends his kid to a school instead of homeschooling, and bless God, he's been put out and said he's going to hell. That's how ridiculous they are. They're going to dissolve themselves and eat themselves up. And I think that the new IFB is going to basically end up like you were talking about. And this is just opinion. I'm not a prophet. I can't speak to the future. But I just think that they're going to be like, well, what's the point of carrying the independent fundamental moniker?
Right.
We're just a church that loves God, and I think that they're going to go that route. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that's where I see it. So to all of that to come around and say, hey, what do you think? It's God's prerogative to do any type of reform. Do I think it's going to happen? No.
Well, on that hopeful note, maybe I should ask a happier question at the end of these, but But no, yeah, I think there's a lot of really helpful perspectives, I think, out of this. And I think, and I appreciate you sharing, and being willing to, it's encouraging to me, that there have been so many people. Like, it's encouraging me that there are people like you who are, pastors, people who are all different kind of perspectives that are willing to sit down and don't feel, threatened to sit down on my show and chat about these things. And that, I think this, when it comes to reform or when it comes to shutting certain things down, which I think a lot of all of those things need to happen in different ways. I think that the only way it's going to happen is if we keep having conversations and dialogue like this. So, I really appreciate you coming on.
Can I say one quick thing?
Yeah.
I want to send, if you don't mind, I want to give a message. If anybody's listening to this and is listening to it from a perspective, if you've been abused, let me say this: get help. You need help. If you're from a perspective that you woke out of legalism, if you've come out of legalism, can I just encourage you, jump into the Word of God? And if I could recommend a couple of things: number one, study Galatians. Study the book of Galatians. Number two, get Chuck Swindoll's book, The Grace Awakening. Read that book. Read R.C. Sproul's The Holiness of God. Those would be the resources those would be resources that I would say, if you're coming out of legalism. You asked this about somebody that didn't leave the faith but stayed in the church. It was things like that helped me say, wait, God's not like this.
Right.
This is what the God of the Bible is. And it study the book of Galatians. That's where Paul really fundamentally deals with legalism in the church and the proper perspective of that. And then if there's resources that I would say, it would be Chuck Swindoll's The Grace Awakening, and to balance that out, The Holiness of God by R.C. Sproul.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I don't tend to. I try to avoid, going too deep into that, because it's not ultimately a theological podcast at the
right.
root. Right. But certainly, if I'm giving my perspective as a Christian as well, I definitely can endorse Holiness of God. I'm not familiar with the other book, which I'm interested to check out, but Holiness of God is a really, really good book. And just, I mean, one of the biggest things that pulled me out of the movement was studying the Bible that we were taught so much was important. So
absolutely,
but again, wherever you guys are on that journey, the one thing I'm not going to say is like fake it till you make it, or just try to hang in there. And if you've experienced abuse, if you're struggling with any kind of mental, any kind of mental blowback from the movement, which I think anybody who's been in it for a long time has some form of that. Address it, deal with it through proper channels of counseling, through, do whatever you need to do. But just, go at your pace and try to figure out what the truth is. And, I've said it before on the show, but, if you're looking for the truth, you're going to find it. It doesn't have anywhere to hide. And, the more you fact check the truth, the more it comes back true. So, so you don't have to be worried about researching and studying. So, but, I gotta wrap it up there, because I gotta actually have another appointment I gotta run to here in a little bit. But John, thank you so much for jumping on, for doing doing the interview.
Thank you.
And where can people find you if they wanted to see any more from you, or if they wanted to keep in touch, or is there a good place to keep in touch?
Well, I'm really not the social media savvy guy. I got Facebook, and that's about it. But our church website is calvarybaptistmanchester.com. And from there, we have a media page where our messages are. We have a SoundCloud page that is linked there, Calvary Church out of Manchester. So a lot of our messages and stuff are on there.
Perfect. All right, guys. So if you want to connect, you can connect there. If you want to see more from John's perspective, that's a good place to go and check it out. But until next time, we'll go ahead and sign it off.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Preacher Boys podcast. If you appreciated the content on the show, Please leave a review on iTunes and don't forget to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter with the handle @PreacherBoysDoc. Additional information can always be found on PreacherBoysDoc.com.
If you're a defender fighting to protect your organization from cyber attackers, you must be successful ending attacks every single time. They only need to be successful once. Cyber Reason reverses the attacker's advantage. Our future-ready attack platform gives defenders the wisdom to uncover, understand, and piece together multiple threats, and the precision focus to end cyber attacks instantly. Together, we are the defenders. Cyber Reason. End cyber attacks. From endpoints to everywhere. Learn more at cyberreason.com. That's CYBEREASON.com.
Zenni's Blocks lenses help to protect the eyes by keeping harmful blue light out. Because they're virtually clear, add blocks to any Zenni frame for stylish, all-day protection. Get a complete pair of prescription or non-prescription blocks glasses starting at just $24. Protect your eyes now at Zenni.com.